My name is Martha, and at 55 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. Last Thanksgiving, as I watched my family gather around our dining table, I felt that familiar warmth of having everyone together. My husband Harold sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey with his usual precision, while our son Kenneth laughed at something his wife Brenda had whispered in his ear. The candles flickered softly, casting dancing shadows across the faces I loved most. But beneath that peaceful surface, something had been stirring for months, something I had been carefully watching and waiting for. Before I share what happened that evening, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Please hit that like button if this story resonates with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Looking back now, I realize how naive I had been to believe that 32 years of marriage could shield us from the storms that destroy so many families. Harold and I had built what I thought was an unshakable foundation together. We met in college when I was studying education, and he was pursuing his business degree. He was the steady, reliable type who always showed up when he promised, always remembered our anniversary, and never forgot to kiss me goodnight, even after decades together. Harold worked his way up at Midwestern Insurance Company, starting as a claims adjuster and eventually becoming a senior manager. His days were predictable, his routine comforting. He left for work at 7:30 every morning with his coffee in the same travel mug I had given him 10 Christmases ago, and he returned home by 6:15, sometimes 6:30, if traffic was particularly heavy on Interstate 49. Our son Kenneth had been the light of our lives from the moment he drew his first breath. He was one of those children who never gave us sleepless nights, who excelled in school without being pushed, who played baseball in high school and earned a full scholarship to study engineering at the state university. When he graduated and landed a job at Harrison Engineering, Harold and I felt like we had won the parenting lottery. 3 years ago, Kenneth introduced us to Brenda, a 25-year-old hairstylist he had met at a coffee shop downtown. She was undeniably beautiful, with long blonde hair that caught the light just right and a smile that could charm anyone within a 50-foot radius. I remember the first time Kenneth brought her to Sunday dinner, how she complimented everything from my pot roast to the way I had arranged the flowers on the table. At first, I was genuinely happy for Kenneth. Brenda seemed sweet, if a little young for him, and she made him laugh in ways I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. She worked at an upscale salon called Mystique, where she catered to wealthy clients who paid premium prices for her services. She often talked about her regular customers, describing their elaborate vacation plans and expensive jewelry with an admiration that seemed innocent enough at the time. The wedding was small but lovely, held at the Botanical Gardens with just immediate family and close friends. Brenda looked radiant in her simple white dress, and Kenneth couldn't stop grinning as they exchanged vows. Harold walked her down the aisle since her own father had passed away years earlier, and I remember feeling touched by the gesture, thinking it showed what a caring family we had become. After they married, Brenda began spending more time at our house, especially when Kenneth was away on business trips for his engineering firm. She would drop by in the afternoons, sometimes bringing coffee for Harold and me, other times asking if she could use our larger kitchen to prepare dinner for Kenneth's return. I appreciated her thoughtfulness and saw it as a sign that she was truly trying to become part of our family. But even during those early months, there were tiny moments that made me pause. The way Brenda would touch Harold's arm when she laughed at his stories, how she always seemed to need his help reaching something on a high shelf, or how she would linger in conversations with him long after the topic had been exhausted. I pushed these observations to the back of my mind, telling myself that I was being overly protective of my family dynamic, that it was natural for a young woman to look up to her father-in-law. Harold seemed to enjoy the attention, and why wouldn't he? Here was this vibrant young woman who hung on his every word, who asked his advice about everything from car maintenance to investment strategies. He began staying up later in the evenings when she visited, helping her with various tasks or simply talking about topics that I found myself excluded from, either by lack of interest or by their subtle body language that suggested these were private conversations. I convinced myself that this was healthy, that it meant our family was truly blending together. After all, Wasn't this what I had always hoped for when Kenneth got married? That his wife would become like a daughter to us, that we would have the kind of close, loving, extended family that I had envied in other people? Looking back, I realized that hope made me blind to what was happening right in front of me. The first crack in my carefully constructed denial appeared on a Tuesday evening in late September. Harold had called around 4 o'clock to say he would be late coming home, something about an important client meeting that had run over schedule. This wasn't unusual, as Harold took his work seriously, and clients often needed extra attention during claim settlements or policy renewals. But when he finally walked through the door at nearly 9 o'clock, something felt different. His usually neat appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened more than usual, and there was a scent about him that I couldn't immediately place. When I asked about his evening, he was vague, mentioning names of clients I had never heard him discuss before, and describing meetings that sounded more elaborate than his usual business encounters. Over the following weeks, these late evenings became more frequent. Harold, who had been as reliable as sunrise for 3 decades, suddenly had a calendar full of evening appointments, weekend client emergencies, and out-of-town conferences that required overnight stays. His explanations were always reasonable, delivered with the same calm confidence that had made him successful in insurance, but something in my gut whispered that the man I had shared a bed with for 32 years was becoming a stranger. His phone habits changed too. The device that used to sit casually on the kitchen counter while he read the evening news was now constantly in his pocket or placed face down on surfaces where I couldn't see the screen. When it buzzed during dinner, he would glance at it with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of anticipation and secrecy that made my stomach clench with an emotion I didn't want to name. Harold also began paying attention to his appearance in ways that puzzled me. The man who had worn the same cologne for 20 years suddenly came home with a new bottle of something called Midnight Attraction. He started going to the gym 3 times a week, claiming his doctor had recommended more exercise for his blood pressure, though his last physical had shown perfectly normal readings. New shirts appeared in his closet, styles that were younger and more fitted than his usual conservative button-downs. During this time, Brenda's visits to our house became more frequent and somehow more intimate. She would arrive in the late afternoons when she knew Harold would be home from work, always with some reasonable excuse. She needed to borrow our stepladder, or she wanted to use our printer because hers was broken, or she was hoping Harold could look at a strange noise her car was making. I began to notice how she dressed for these visits. The casual jeans and sweaters she wore to family dinners were replaced by more form-fitting outfits, blouses that showed just enough to be noticeable, skirts that required her to tug them down when she sat. Her makeup was more carefully applied, her hair styled with the professional skill she used at the salon. The conversations between Harold and Brenda took on a different quality, too. They would speak in lower voices, their heads bent closer together, and they would often stop talking abruptly when I entered the room. Harold would clear his throat and ask me something mundane about dinner plans or weekend chores, while Brenda would suddenly remember an appointment she needed to rush off to. One evening in early October, I walked into the kitchen to find them standing near the refrigerator, closer than necessary for any normal conversation. Brenda's hand was resting on Harold's forearm, and they were both looking at her phone screen, their faces inches apart. When they heard my footsteps, they stepped away from each other with the guilty quickness of children caught stealing cookies. "Oh, Martha," Brenda had said, her voice slightly breathless. "I was just showing Harold some pictures from our vacation to Branson last month. You remember when Kenneth and I went to see those shows?" Harold nodded enthusiastically, perhaps too enthusiastically. "Beautiful scenery down there. Makes me want to plan a trip for us, Martha." But I had seen Kenneth's vacation photos weeks earlier, and somehow I doubted that scenic landscapes required quite so much intimate examination or whispered commentary. That night, as Harold showered, I noticed he was humming. Harold never hummed. In 32 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times I had heard him express such unconscious joy. The sound chilled me more than any argument or harsh word ever could have. I lay awake long after Harold's breathing became deep and regular beside me, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that I was imagining things that stress from my part-time job at the library was making me paranoid, that the changes I was seeing were simply signs of a man entering a new phase of life. But deep in my heart, in that place where wives know things they cannot yet prove, I understood that my marriage was under attack, and the enemy was sleeping in my son's bed just 5 miles away. By November, my suspicions had crystallized into certainty, but I needed proof before I could act on what my heart already knew. The woman I had always been, the trusting wife and accommodating mother-in-law, was quietly transforming into someone I had never imagined I could become, a detective in my own life. I called my old friend Gloria Peterson, whom I had known since high school but had lost touch with over the years. Gloria had gone into private investigation after her divorce 15 years earlier, and she had built a reputation for handling delicate family matters with discretion and thoroughness. When I explained my situation, she listened without judgment and agreed to help me uncover the truth. "Martha," she said during our coffee meeting at a diner across town, "I want you to be prepared for what we might find. Sometimes the evidence is worse than the suspicions, and once you know for certain, you can't unknow it." I told her I understood, but nothing could have prepared me for the manila envelope she handed me 2 weeks later. Inside were photographs that made my 32-year marriage feel like a lie I had been telling myself. Harold and Brenda entering the Riverside Inn on Maple Street. Harold and Brenda in the parking lot of that same motel, embracing with a passion I hadn't seen from my husband in years. Brenda leaving the Regency Suites downtown at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon. The same Thursday, Harold had supposedly been in meetings until 5. Gloria had also discovered financial records that painted an even more disturbing picture. Harold had been renting a small apartment in the downtown district for 6 months, paying $900 a month for what the lease described as a, quote, love nest retreat. Credit card statements showed expensive dinners at restaurants Harold and I had never visited together, jewelry purchases from stores that specialized in gifts for younger women, and hotel charges for nights when Harold had supposedly been sleeping in his own bed beside me. The timeline Gloria constructed was brutally precise. The affair had begun in early June, just 3 weeks after Kenneth and Brenda's second wedding anniversary. What started as innocent coffee meetings had escalated quickly to afternoon encounters, then to elaborate overnight trips disguised as business travel. Harold had been living a double life with the skill of someone who had discovered talents he never knew he possessed. But Gloria's investigation revealed something even more shocking. Brenda Morrison, as she was known before marrying Kenneth, had a criminal history that included fraud charges in 2 other states. She had been accused of targeting older men in financially comfortable situations, gaining their trust, and then manipulating them into making poor financial decisions that benefited her at the expense of their families. The pattern was always the same. Brenda would identify a vulnerable man, usually someone going through a midlife crisis or feeling unappreciated at home. She would shower him with attention and affection, making him feel young and desirable again. Once she had established emotional control, she would begin suggesting investments, business opportunities, or simply expensive gifts that would drain his resources while building her own financial security. In Missouri, she had convinced a 60-year-old businessman to invest nearly $50,000 in a fictitious real estate venture. In Arkansas, she had persuaded a recently widowed man to purchase expensive jewelry and electronics that she then sold for cash. The charges had been dropped in both cases when the men refused to testify, too embarrassed by their own gullibility to pursue justice. "She's not just an opportunist, Martha," Gloria explained as we sat in her cramped office, surrounded by filing cabinets and surveillance equipment. "She's a professional predator. She studies her targets, learns their weaknesses, and then exploits them systematically. Your husband isn't her first victim, and if we don't stop her, he won't be her last." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was my husband betraying our marriage, but he was being manipulated by someone who made a living destroying families. Harold, for all his flaws and weaknesses, was essentially a good man who had been trapped by someone with far more experience in deception than he had in recognizing it. I asked Gloria to continue surveillance while I decided how to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to confront Harold immediately, to throw the evidence in his face and demand an explanation. But a larger part of me, a part that was growing stronger and more calculating with each passing day, wanted to wait for the right moment to act. I began to understand that this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. This was about protecting my son from a woman who had married him as part of an elaborate con game, about preventing other families from falling victim to Brenda's schemes, and about ensuring that justice was served in a way that would prevent her from hurting anyone else. Gloria helped me develop a plan that would expose Brenda's true nature while giving me the maximum advantage in the inevitable divorce proceedings. We would continue gathering evidence while I quietly secured my financial assets and prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. The key, Gloria advised, is to make sure she shows her true colors in front of witnesses, especially Kenneth. He needs to see who he really married, and it needs to be undeniable. As I drove home that evening, I realized that the woman who had entered Gloria's office that morning was not the same woman who was leaving. The trusting, accommodating Martha was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the people we love most require protection from their own poor judgment. And sometimes the only way to save a family is to be willing to fight for it. The next phase of my plan required patience and precision that I had never known I possessed. Over the following weeks, I transformed myself into a student of deception, learning to hide my knowledge while gathering information that would be crucial when the time came to act. I opened a separate bank account at a different branch and began quietly transferring funds from our joint savings, being careful to move amounts small enough to avoid triggering any automatic notifications to Harold. I gathered important documents, tax returns, insurance policies, property deeds, and investment statements, making copies and storing them in a safety deposit box that Harold knew nothing about. My lawyer, Patricia Brennan, was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in complex divorce cases involving infidelity and financial deception. When I showed her Gloria's evidence, she whistled low and shook her head. "This is one of the most calculated cases of manipulation I've seen in 20 years of practice," she said, studying the photographs and financial records spread across her mahogany desk. "But it also gives us tremendous leverage. If Harold has been using marital assets to fund this affair, especially with someone who has a criminal history, we can protect almost everything in the divorce settlement." Patricia helped me understand my rights and options while we continued building an airtight case. She also advised me about the criminal aspects of Brenda's behavior, suggesting that we would need to involve law enforcement once we were ready to move forward. During this period, I had to maintain the facade of normalcy at home, acting the role of the unsuspecting wife, while every interaction with Harold felt like swallowing glass. He would kiss me good morning and tell me he loved me, then spend his lunch hour texting the woman who was systematically destroying our family. He would ask about my day over dinner, then excuse himself to take work calls that I now knew were conversations with Brenda about their next meeting. The hardest part was watching Kenneth, who remained completely oblivious to his wife's true nature. He would call to tell me about their weekend plans or ask for advice about anniversary gifts, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from warning him about the viper he had married. Kenneth deserved to know the truth, but I also understood that he needed to discover it in a way that would make denial impossible. I began having regular lunch meetings with Kenneth, ostensibly just to spend more time together, but actually to assess his marriage from his perspective. What I learned broke my heart. Kenneth truly loved Brenda and was working extra hours to save money for a house with a bigger yard, hoping to start a family soon. He mentioned that Brenda seemed stressed lately, often coming home late from work and being less affectionate than usual. "Sometimes I wonder if she's having second thoughts about being married," he confided during one of our lunches at his favorite barbecue restaurant. "She's been distant, and when I try to talk to her about it, she changes the subject or finds something else she needs to do." I wanted to grab my son's shoulders and shake him, to tell him that his wife's distraction had nothing to do with marriage anxiety and everything to do with the fact that she was too busy seducing his father to pay attention to her actual husband. Instead, I squeezed his hand and told him that all marriages go through difficult periods, that communication and patience were the keys to working through problems. Meanwhile, Gloria continued her surveillance, documenting every meeting between Harold and Brenda. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. They met at least 3 times a week, always at different locations, always during times when Kenneth was at work and I was supposedly busy with my own activities. Harold had become an expert at creating alibis, but Gloria was better at seeing through them. The breakthrough came in mid-November when Gloria discovered that Brenda was simultaneously running a similar con on another man, a retired widower named Frank Williams who lived across town. Frank was 72 years old, lonely since his wife's death 2 years earlier, and worth nearly $2 million in retirement savings and life insurance settlements. Brenda had been visiting Frank twice a week, supposedly helping him with household chores and grocery shopping, but actually working to gain his trust and access to his financial accounts. Gloria had photographs of Brenda entering Frank's house with overnight bags, credit card records showing expensive purchases made with Frank's accounts, and even recordings of phone conversations where Brenda discussed moving in with Frank permanently once she could, quote, get rid of some complications in her current living situation. This revelation changed everything. Brenda wasn't just a woman having an affair. She was a serial predator who was actively working multiple victims simultaneously. Harold was being used as a stepping stone to something bigger, and Kenneth was simply collateral damage in a scheme that was far more elaborate and cruel than I had initially understood. I realized that Thanksgiving dinner would be the perfect opportunity to expose everything. The entire family would be together, there would be multiple witnesses, and the holiday setting would make Brenda's true nature even more shocking when it was revealed. I began planning the dinner that would end my marriage, save my son, and hopefully put a dangerous criminal behind bars. The invitations went out 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and I made sure to mention how much I was looking forward to having everyone together for what might be a very memorable celebration. Looking back, I realized that my voice probably carried a tone that should have warned them, but people who are living double lives often hear only what they expect to hear. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that makes people grateful for warm houses and family gatherings. I had been awake since 4 o'clock, not from anxiety but from anticipation. After months of careful planning and patient waiting, the day had finally arrived when everything would be revealed. I prepared the meal with more care than I had shown in years, partly because I wanted everything to be perfect for what might be our last family dinner, and partly because the familiar rituals of cooking helped calm the storm of emotion swirling inside me. The turkey went into the oven at 6:30, the sweet potatoes were peeled and ready for mashing, and the dining room table was set with our best china and the crystal glasses we saved for special occasions. Harold spent the morning watching football and occasionally wandering into the kitchen to sample various dishes, playing the role of the devoted husband with the same skill he had been displaying for months. He complimented my stuffing, kissed my cheek while I stirred the gravy, and asked if there was anything he could do to help. The performance was so convincing that I almost felt sorry for him, knowing that his world was about to collapse in ways he couldn't imagine. Kenneth and Brenda arrived at 2 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Kenneth realized. Brenda looked stunning as always, wearing a burgundy dress that flattered her figure and highlighted her blonde hair. She hugged me warmly and complimented the decorations I had arranged throughout the house, playing her own role with the same practiced ease that had fooled all of us for so long. "Martha, everything looks absolutely beautiful," she said, surveying the dining room with apparent admiration. "You always make holidays feel so special and welcoming." If she felt any guilt about the affair she was conducting with my husband, any remorse about the lies she was telling my son, any concern about the criminal activities Gloria had documented, it didn't show in her face or voice. Brenda Morrison was a professional in every sense of the word. The dinner itself was a masterpiece of hidden tension disguised as family harmony. Harold carved the turkey with his usual precision, making jokes about his technique and praising my cooking skills. Kenneth regaled us with stories from his latest engineering project, describing challenges and solutions with the enthusiasm he had inherited from his father. Brenda listened attentively, asked appropriate questions, and seemed every inch the loving wife and devoted daughter-in-law. But I was watching for the details that others might miss, and they were there for anyone who knew what to look for. The way Brenda's eyes lingered on Harold when she thought no one was watching, the subtle smile that crossed Harold's face when Brenda complimented the wine selection, the brief moment when their hands touched as they both reached for the salt, a contact that lasted just a fraction too long to be entirely innocent. As we finished the main course and I began clearing plates, Kenneth excused himself to take a business call from a client who was having an emergency with a construction project. "I'm sorry, Mom, but this would just take a few minutes. They're having problems with the foundation measurements, and I need to walk them through the calculations." He stepped outside onto the back porch with his phone, leaving Harold, Brenda, and me alone in the dining room. The atmosphere immediately shifted, becoming charged with the unspoken tensions that had been building for months. Harold began gathering serving dishes, moving around the table with nervous energy, while Brenda sat quietly, her wine glass poised halfway to her lips. "This has been such a lovely day," Brenda said, her voice carrying a tone I had never heard before, something that sounded almost like challenge. "There's nothing quite like family time, is there, Martha?" "No," I replied carefully, sensing that we were approaching the moment I had been preparing for. "There certainly isn't." Brenda set down her wine glass and reached into her purse, withdrawing a manila envelope that looked familiar. My heart began beating faster as I realized what was about to happen, but I maintained my composure, keeping my expression neutral and expectant. "Actually, Martha," Brenda continued, her voice becoming firmer and more confident, "I have something for you, something I think you need to see." She stood up and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of my chair. Harold had frozen in place near the kitchen doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide with what looked like panic. Clearly, this wasn't part of any plan he had been aware of. Brenda extended the envelope toward me, with a smile that contained no warmth or affection, only triumph and cruelty. "Since you're too stupid to notice, here are the photos of me sleeping with your husband." The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. Harold made a choking sound and dropped the serving platter he had been holding, sending it crashing to the floor in an explosion of ceramic shards. But I remained perfectly calm, accepting the envelope with steady hands and opening it with the same care I might use to examine any other piece of mail. Inside were photographs that would have destroyed me 6 months earlier. Images of Harold and Brenda in intimate embraces, entering and leaving hotels, kissing in restaurant parking lots. The pictures were clear, undeniable, and devastating. They represented the complete betrayal of everything I had believed about my marriage and my family. I studied each photograph carefully, my face betraying no emotion, while Brenda watched me with the satisfaction of someone who believes she has just delivered a killing blow. Harold remained frozen near the kitchen, apparently too shocked by his lover's revelation to speak or move. "Well," Brenda said after I had looked through all the photos, "aren't you going to say something? Aren't you going to cry or scream or throw something?" I looked up at her with what I hoped was an expression of mild interest. "Actually, Brenda, I have something for you too." I reached into my own purse and withdrew my phone, scrolling through the photos until I found the video I had been waiting months to share. I had been waiting for this moment. I held the phone so that both Brenda and Harold could see the screen, then pressed play. The video showed Brenda entering the house of Frank Williams, the 72-year-old widower, carrying an overnight bag and using a key that suggested she had been given permanent access to his home. The color drained from Brenda's face as she watched herself embracing Frank in his living room, the same passionate way she had been embracing Harold in their secret photographs. But this video had been taken just 2 days earlier, which meant she had been conducting multiple affairs simultaneously while married to Kenneth and supposedly planning a future with Harold. "What is this?" Harold whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "This, Harold, is your girlfriend visiting her other boyfriend," I replied calmly. "Frank Williams, age 72, widowed, worth approximately $2 million. She's been seeing him twice a week for the past 4 months, just like she's been seeing you." The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. Harold stared at the phone screen as if he could make the images disappear through sheer force of will, while Brenda's face cycled through expressions of shock, anger, and calculation as she tried to determine the best way to respond to this unexpected development. "You don't understand," Brenda began, her voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who suddenly realizes their carefully constructed plans are crumbling. "Harold and I have something real. What you saw with that old man, it's not what you think. I was just helping him with household chores, being neighborly." I smiled at her with the kind of patience usually reserved for small children, telling obvious lies. Really? Is that what you call this? I scrolled to another video, this one showing Brenda and Frank in a passionate embrace in his kitchen, their behavior clearly indicating a relationship that went far beyond neighborly assistance. Then I showed them bank records Gloria had obtained, documenting transfers from Frank's accounts to pay for expenses that coincidentally matched Harold's secret apartment rent and the expensive dinners he thought he had been paying for. You see, Brenda, while you've been playing house with my husband, you've also been running a con game on Frank Williams. The apartment Harold thinks he's been renting for your romantic encounters? Frank's been paying for it. The jewelry Harold thinks he bought you? Frank's credit card. Even some of those expensive dinners you two have been enjoying were funded by money you stole from a lonely old man who trusted you. Harold's face went through several shades of pale as the implications sank in. Not only had he been cheating on his wife, but he had been an unwitting participant in defrauding an elderly victim. The romantic affair he thought he was conducting had actually been a carefully orchestrated crime, and he had been nothing more than a tool in Brenda's larger scheme. That's impossible, Harold stammered. Brenda told me she was paying for the apartment with money she saved from her salon work. She said the jewelry was costume pieces she bought wholesale through a friend. Harold, I said gently, the way I might speak to someone who had just received devastating news. Brenda Morrison has been running these kinds of cons for years. She has fraud convictions in Missouri and Arkansas. She targets men going through midlife crises, makes them feel special and desired, then uses them to get close to wealthier victims. You weren't her endgame, Harold. You were her practice round. The sound of Kenneth's footsteps on the back porch interrupted our confrontation. Brenda's eyes darted toward the door, and for a moment I saw raw panic cross her features. Whatever she had planned for this evening, it certainly hadn't included being exposed as a serial con artist in front of her husband. You have to listen to me, she whispered urgently to Harold. She's lying about everything. Those videos are fake, or taken out of context or something. You know what we have together is real. You know how I feel about you. But Harold was staring at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The spell she had cast over him was breaking, replaced by the horrible realization that he had risked everything for someone who had never cared about him at all. Kenneth opened the back door just as the tension in the room reached its peak. He looked around at our faces, immediately sensing that something significant had happened in his absence. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who could feel the emotional electricity in the air but couldn't identify its source. "Actually, Kenneth," I said, standing up and moving to put my arm around my son's shoulders, "there's something you need to know about your wife." I handed him my phone, showing him the same videos I had just shared with Harold and Brenda. Kenneth watched in confusion at first, not understanding what he was seeing, then with growing horror as the reality became clear. "Brenda," he said, his voice barely audible. "What is this? Who is this man?" Before she could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see 2 police cars parked in our driveway, their presence the result of a call I had made 3 days earlier, when Gloria informed me that the district attorney was ready to file charges against Brenda for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. "That would be the police," I announced calmly. "They're here to arrest Brenda for defrauding Frank Williams and several other elderly victims. Gloria Peterson, the private investigator I hired, has been working with the prosecutor's office to build a case against her." Brenda made a desperate attempt to flee, heading for the back door, but Harold stepped into her path. The man who had been her willing accomplice just minutes earlier now looked at her with disgust and rage. "You used me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe you cared about me, that we had a future together, and all the time I was just part of some sick game you were playing." "Harold, please," Brenda pleaded, but her words rang hollow now that the truth was exposed. The police entered the house after I let them in, and Detective Rodriguez, whom I had been working with for the past week, approached Brenda with handcuffs ready. "Brenda Morrison, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, theft, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the detective read Brenda her rights, Kenneth sank into a chair, his face in his hands. The woman he had loved and trusted the woman he had planned to start a family with, was being arrested for crimes that painted her as a predator who had targeted his own family. Harold stood motionless in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by the debris of our Thanksgiving dinner and the wreckage of the life he had known just hours earlier. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were filled with shame and regret so profound that I almost felt sorry for him. "Martha," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Not now, Harold. We'll have plenty of time to talk about your part in all of this later." As the police led Brenda away, she turned back to look at me one final time. The mask of sweet innocence she had worn for 3 years was completely gone, replaced by the cold calculation of someone whose carefully planned scheme had been thoroughly destroyed. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying a threat that might have frightened me 6 months earlier. "Yes, Brenda," I replied calmly. "It is. 6 months have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything, and I'm sitting in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, watching the sun stream through windows that somehow seem brighter than they used to. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if removing the lies and deception has allowed fresh air to flow through rooms that had been suffocating under the weight of secrets." The legal proceedings moved quickly once Brenda was arrested. The evidence Gloria and I had gathered, combined with testimonies from Frank Williams and 2 other elderly victims who came forward after seeing news reports about the case, resulted in a plea bargain that sent Brenda to prison for 3 years. She'll also be required to make restitution to her victims, though I doubt Frank will ever recover the emotional trust that was stolen along with his money. Harold and I divorced 2 months ago. The process was surprisingly straightforward, thanks to Patricia Brennan's skilled representation and the overwhelming evidence of Harold's infidelity and involvement in Brenda's schemes. I kept the house, the majority of our savings, and my dignity intact. Harold moved to an apartment across town and eventually transferred to a different branch of his insurance company, unable to face the whispers and knowing looks from colleagues who had heard about his spectacular fall from grace. He calls occasionally, usually late at night when I suspect he's been drinking, to apologize and ask if there's any chance for reconciliation. These conversations are brief and awkward. I don't hate Harold, but I no longer trust him, and trust, once broken so completely, cannot be repaired with words alone. He made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. Kenneth has been slowly rebuilding his life as well. The divorce from Brenda was finalized a month after her arrest, and he's been seeing a counselor to work through the trauma of discovering that his marriage was built on lies and manipulation. We have dinner together twice a week now, something we rarely did when he was married, and our relationship has grown closer than it's been since he was a teenager. "I should have seen it," he told me during one of our recent dinners. "There were signs, things that didn't add up, but I was so in love with the idea of being married that I ignored my instincts." I assured him that Brenda was a professional manipulator who had fooled people far more experienced than he was, but I could see that he was still struggling with feelings of guilt and betrayal. Time and therapy are helping, but some wounds heal slowly. As for me, I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed during those months of investigation and planning. The woman who had spent 32 years being accommodating and trusting learned that she could be strategic and decisive when protecting her family required it. I joined a support group for women who have experienced infidelity, and I found purpose in helping others navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges that come with rebuilding a life after betrayal. I've also reconnected with old friends like Gloria, whose skills as a private investigator probably saved our family from even greater financial and emotional damage. We have coffee every Friday morning, and she's become one of my closest confidants, someone who understands the strange mixture of sadness and relief that comes with discovering painful truths. The house that used to echo with the voices of 4 people now holds just 1, but it doesn't feel lonely. I've redecorated the living room, planted a new garden in the backyard, and turned Harold's former office into a reading room, where I spend peaceful hours with books that I never had time for during my married years. I've been taking dance lessons at the community center, something I always wanted to do but never made time for when I was busy maintaining a marriage that was slowly dissolving around me. The other students are mostly women my age or older, many of them divorced or widowed, all of us learning new steps and discovering that life doesn't end when one chapter closes. There are moments when I feel sad about the waste of it all, the years of marriage that ended in betrayal, the family holidays that will never be the same, the trust that was broken and can never be fully repaired. But those moments are balanced by a sense of freedom I haven't felt since I was young, the knowledge that I no longer have to pretend or accommodate or ignore my instincts in order to keep peace in a home that was already at war. I think about Brenda sometimes, wondering if prison will teach her anything about the damage she causes, or if she's simply planning her next con game for when she's released. I hope Frank Williams is healing from his experience and learning to trust again, though I know that's a difficult journey for someone his age who thought he had found companionship in his golden years. Most of all, I've learned that love without respect is just manipulation, that trust is the foundation of every relationship worth having, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their destructive choices. I spent 3 decades being the kind of wife who never questioned, never demanded, never made waves, and in doing so, I nearly allowed our family to be destroyed by someone who saw our kindness as weakness. The Martha who existed 6 months ago would have been devastated by Harold's betrayal, would have blamed herself, would have begged him to come back and work on the marriage. The Martha who exists today understands that some betrayals are so fundamental that they change not just the relationship, but the people involved in it. Harold didn't just cheat on our marriage, he participated in victimizing elderly people, and that's not something that can be forgiven with flowers and promises to do better. Kenneth asked me recently if I ever regret exposing everything, if I sometimes wish I had just quietly confronted Harold and Brenda and tried to resolve things privately. The answer is no, without hesitation. Brenda was a predator who would have continued hurting people if she hadn't been stopped. And Harold was an accomplice who needed to face consequences for his choices. Sometimes doing the right thing requires courage that you don't know you have until circumstances demand it. I wake up every morning now without the knot of anxiety in my stomach that I lived with for months when I knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. I go to sleep every night without wondering who my husband is texting or where he really spent his afternoon. The peace that comes with living in truth, even painful truth, is worth more than the false comfort of beautiful lies. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. There are women everywhere who are living with men who have decided that marriage vows are suggestions rather than commitments, who are being manipulated by people who see kindness as an opportunity for exploitation. To those women, I want to say this: trust your instincts, gather your evidence, protect your assets, and don't be afraid to fight for your own dignity and your family's welfare. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest, not because they're evil, but because they're weak and selfish and willing to sacrifice others for their own immediate gratification. You can love someone and still refuse to be destroyed by them. You can forgive someone without giving them the opportunity to hurt you again. I refuse to become a victim in my own life, and that choice, difficult as it was, gave me back my self-respect and my future. The woman typing these words is not the same woman who lived in this house a year ago, and I'm grateful for that transformation, even though it came at a price I never wanted to pay. If you've made it this far in my story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to make difficult choices to protect your family from someone you trusted? How did you find the strength to act when everything you believed was being challenged? Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they're stronger than they know, and that sometimes the end of one story is really the beginning of a better one. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you the courage to trust yourself when life demands difficult decisions. Until next time, remember that you deserve relationships built on honesty and respect, and you have the power to create the life you want, even when it means starting over at 55.